I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now!, a daily grassroots, unembedded, international, independent news hour. Democracy Now! Is the largest public media collaboration in the United States. We broadcast on close to 300 radio and TV stations, Pacifica radio stations, NPR stations, public access TV stations, on PBS stations, and on both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network, Channel 9415, which is Free Speech TV, 9410, which is Link TV, and also on DirecTV, Channel 375, Link TV. We also video and audio stream at democracynow.org, where millions of people around the world can access us.
Tell me a little bit about your history and how you began as a journalist.
I've been doing journalism since I was a kid in high school. I just thought that was a means to deal with social justice issues, holding people accountable in power. At that time, it was the principal. And then just moving on through college and in communities, working on newsletters. And then afterwards, I discovered WBAI in New York, Pacifica Radio. I was listening at home, and I said, wow, this is an amazing place. What is it? I wanted to know. In the middle of the commercial dial, this place that was not slick, but all the beauty of New York City and all of the horror was reflected right there in that myriad of voices that is New York. And they weren't trying to sell anything. Just let people speak for themselves. And I was just really blown away by it and thought, even better than writing where you're saying, and the woman cried when she described this, to have so much is reflected just in the voice. And so you don't have to describe it in adjectives. You just hear the way a person speaks. And I was hooked. And I was taking some graduate classes in New York in biochemistry because I've always been very interested in science. But I also saw they were teaching a radio documentary course, and so I went over, and the person who was teaching was a producer at WBAI, by chance, that radio station that I listened to. And we walked over together that night, and I never left, and that was 20 years ago.
Interesting. You're a New Yorker?
Yes.
Tell me about 9/11 and how that affected you as a New Yorker in a complete sentence. What were you doing at that moment?
At 8:47 in the morning of September 11, 2001, we were preparing the broadcast of Democracy Now! At the time, we broadcast at 9 o'clock every morning. Now we broadcast at 8. And at 8:47, the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. We didn't know it had happened. We, at the time, worked out of the garret of this century-old firehouse, downtown community television. It's a decommissioned firehouse. And since we were in the garret, no windows, didn't know it had happened. So we started the show. 3 minutes later, the second plane hit the second tower of the World Trade Center. And we're just blocks from Ground Zero. We're the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. And we were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, the day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile as the Pinochet forces rose to power. So the democratically elected leader of Chile died as the US-backed, Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed, ITT-backed, Anaconda Copper-backed Pinochet forces rose to power. And that's what we were looking at that day, the connection between September 11th and terror. And then we got a sense of what was happening, couldn't make any sense of it, started to broadcast and saying this was taking place and hearing what was happening in Washington. And we broadcast throughout the day and brought up people who had survived 9/11. And we were within the evacuation zone right here. We're just a few blocks below Canal Street. And so the military was clearing out people, police were clearing out. And so we just hunkered down here so that we can continue broadcasting. And we did over the next few days because we saw as the war machine was gearing up, people were speaking out against war. people who lost loved ones, like Rita Lasar, who lost her brother, Abe Zalmanowitz, on the 27th floor of the World Trade Center, whose brother was screaming at him, "Get out, get out." But he was working next to his best friend, Ed, who is a paraplegic. He said, as soon as the emergency workers come up and help us bring down Ed, we'll go down together. And they died with 3,000 others, although we'll never know how many died on September 11th, because those who go uncounted in death, in life, go uncounted in death, and they're the undocumented workers who worked at the World Trade Center. But it was horrible. I mean, that day, people in the community started hammering pallets right next to us in the park to bring out the bodies. And it was a brilliant, sunny, clear blue day. And we just kept hearing the hammering right next door. And the only thing worse than the sound of that hammering was when it stopped, when there were no bodies to save. And in those days, we just kept on broadcasting the voices, especially of people who were being heard, the ones that had lost loved ones but were for peace, felt that you can't meet violence with violence, that isn't the answer, that you've got to break the cycle. And there were lots of people. Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez lost their son, Greg Ernesto Rodriguez, above the 100th floor of the World Trade Center. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. 700 of 1,000 workers died in that one company. And they wrote a letter to President Bush asking him not to retaliate, saying, even as they knew the worst pain of their lives, it would only increase their suffering to know that a mother and a father in Afghanistan would soon lose their son. They said, no, not in our name, not in our son's name. Rita Lasar, who lost Abe, said the same. She wrote a letter to the New York Times that actually got published. And she said it would not diminish her pain to know that a woman in Afghanistan would soon lose her brother. Not in our name, not in my brother's name, she said. And this nationwide movement grew up. Not in our name. September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And the media gave voice to a lot of people who lost loved ones, but when they moved from describing their loved ones to a prescription for what should happen, then they cut away and they go to the terrorism experts, Henry Kissinger, Oliver North. Well, as I often say in speeches, I do think they're the terrorism experts. I think the media got it right in that case. It takes one to know one. And I say that when it comes to Henry Kissinger for Chile and the thousands of people who died and how deeply implicated he and Nixon were in supporting Pinochet in Argentina as well, working with the generals in the dirty war that disappeared so many thousands of people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and giving the go-ahead for Indonesia's invasion of Timor. We have to have a universal standard of justice. And we have to hold people accountable. I think Osama bin Laden and his accomplices should be tried for what happened on September 11th, and I think that Henry Kissinger should be tried for war crimes.
Tell me about, I know that you've covered a lot of stories of people who've lost loved ones. Tell me about the personal effect and how it might have changed your perspective in New York, and how you, going forward, how you cope with humanity in the sense when, regardless of nationality, these people have killed other people. How is it to go forward in New York and continue broadcasting with these things like this, and just down the street a couple blocks, thousands of people died? Personally, how has it affected you in a complete sentence?
I think the whole community felt a loss. And it just, I think, drove home even more how important a nonviolent approach saves lives and can accomplish so much more. And I think what we saw that day, the horror of thousands of people killed, we don't want to ever see again. And I really do think that violence breeds violence, and it's not the answer.
Tell me about your views on the current administration in a complete sentence.
One other answer to the previous question was amazing to see people out everywhere in Union Square, thousands of people debating the most important issues of the day, war and peace, life and death, candles everywhere, the conversation taking place everywhere and anywhere. You could say to anyone in New York, where were you at that moment? Whether it's a cab driver or it's someone in a restaurant or just someone walking down the street. And it was a global conversation was taking place at that time. And so much good could come out of the horror because we were communicating. And people, especially in countries that had known terror, I think felt tremendous sympathy, even in countries where that terror was partly because of the United States supporting a repressive regime. We all had something in common. And I think we more had something in common with each other in the United States. I mean, African Americans have known terror for centuries. That's slavery. Native Americans for what's happened here. And now we all experienced it and really talked to each other about what needed to be done. That's pretty rare to have that national conversation that everyone is on the same page with and is disgusted with the media and how it did not reflect those conversations. It just brought us the same small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, beating the drums for war. As for what I think of the Bush administration could not do it alone. If George Bush stood outside the White House on the steps with a bullhorn, he'd reach some people. And, you know, the lies of weapons of mass destruction wouldn't affect that many. But he had the whole U.S. media, unfortunately, he had the whole U.S. media at his disposal. And that is an outrage, that the media has played that role. The Pentagon has deployed something far more powerful than any missile and any bomb, and it is the U.S. media. And the media has got to be unembedded from the military, from the government. We're supposed to be the fourth estate. There's a reason why our profession has been explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution. We're supposed to be the check and balance on those in government. And the media has reached an all-time low in this country. And it's hard to tell the difference between the soldiers and the reporters embedded with the soldiers. We need an independent media, especially in a time of war. And that's why Pacifica Radio, public access TV, indie media, it's all so important. And it's the hope of the future. People ask now, how did we get to this point with President Bush being reelected, with all of the lies that were spewed that have been proven to be lies? Like Iraq had to be attacked because it was connected to 9/11, untrue. Like Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, untrue. And clearly the evidence was there early on that showed that all of this information was untrue. But people wouldn't just believe it if President Bush had said it. Unfortunately, the media was his amplifier. And things will never change if the media continues to play that role as a megaphone for those in power, instead of holding those in power accountable.